All right. Well, welcome, my friends. My name is Bob Mosher. I am the Chief Learning Evangelist for an organization called Ontuitive. We specialize in helping organizations with topics around single-source publishing, but specifically designing and developing and implementing informal learning, from performance support to mobile and some other devices and such we'll talk about today. So we are at booth 69, so if you want to talk more about this after or meet with myself individually or others, we'd be happy to continue the conversation there throughout the rest of the expo. So welcome. Let me ask a couple of questions. Raise your hand if you create training content for classrooms. Raise your hand if you create e-learning. Raise your hand if you create job aids, PowerPoints, FAQs. Okay. Raise your hand if you have unlimited time to do all those things I just listed. I mean, I've been at this for 30 years. This is my 30th anniversary in the learning business. And when I first started doing this about 30 years ago, I taught Lotus 1, 2, 3. Now, a few younger people, this was a spreadsheet that came before Excel. You may know now. But I wrote that course, and we taught it for 2.5 years. 2.5 years before we rewrote it again, before we edited a page, before we changed any content. And we wrote it in something called WordPerfect. Anyone remember WordPerfect in this room? Again, a few younger people. That was a word processor that came before Word, and it was a very different time. But the world we live in today, I hope you agree, is very, very different. Learners are changing. Content is dynamic. The idea of shelf life is absurd in content today. Any of you thinking of going into mobile down the road? I saw the mobile learning guy was just before me. Some of you may be considering this. So, guys, what that has done to us as designers and developers is it has put on the burden on us to keep a single source of content current across multiple modalities, multiple audiences, multiple courses, multiple softwares, at a level that I think we've never been tasked with before, and I think many would argue we are losing the battle. How many of you kind of feel that way? A bit overwhelmed by the sheer, yeah. Okay, so my presentation today is going to be about this, I'm going to say not new, I'll talk a bit about that in a moment, but re-emerging world of single source authoring or multi-channel publishing. How many of you have done any of this at all in the past? Raise your hand. Some have tried. Okay, let's take a look at this. Here's what I want to sort of level, and you can get a copy of these slides too, by the way, if you'd like them. My email is at the end. Again, you can visit us at our booth. So don't worry about writing them all down or the content. I know they're also being recorded. We'd be happy to get you a copy of these. But I want to sort of set the landscape for the world that we are charged with meeting today. Wonderful research out of a gentleman named Dr. Conrad Gottfredson out of Brigham Young University in Utah in the States. What he looked at it. How many of you have tried blended learning in here? Okay. Kahn took a look at blended learning programs back in the early 90s to see how effective they were. And what he realized was, although blended learning was using multiple modalities, blended learning to the learner means you're going to blend everything I see. So then in my journey to be competent, you're going to help me. That's how they interpret blended learning. And what he found when he looked at many blended learning programs, many of them were falling very short of that promise. And so he came out with what are called the 5 moments of need. And what he realized is when you architect or design learning, any learner will need one or more of these 5 moments throughout their journey towards competency. The first 2, when someone learns for the first time or when someone learns more. This may sound familiar to you. This is formal instruction. We meet it today through e-learning, through, right, a number of things. How many of you do this right now? Raise your hands. You build learning for these needs. The rest of you are just here to eat lunch and listen to me. Okay. Here's the problem, you guys. What Kahn realized in his research is, get this, learners only spend 10 to 15% of their life, 10 to 15% of their life in moments 1 and 2. They spend 90 to 85% of their life here, trying to remember or apply, trying to keep up with being incorrect, and trying to keep up with change. This is performance support or informal instruction. What Kahn found out, folks, in his work is that many blended learning programs from a need-based analysis stopped at moments 1 and 2 and kind of dabbled in 3 through 5. They basically, see if this sounds familiar, they took a 5-day course, they made it 2, they built e-learning on either side of it, so the learner could do something offline and get some work done. So when they came to class, they had some homework to do. That was blended learning. Well, what Kahn found out in his work is if you look at the need that met, guys, that was not blended learning. That was blended training. We were just mixing up moments 1 and 2. We were not really blending into moments 3 through 5. So my challenge to you today is if you're going to be an effective instructional designer or learner or learning professional, we have to challenge ourselves to meet the 5 moments. All right, so, great. Here's the problem. A lot of you are exhausted meeting 1 and 2 right now. All your resources, all your time, your tools, your design is consumed meeting moments 1 and 2. So my talk today is about, is there a discipline out there? Are there tools and software and instructional approaches that help us with the resources we have, the budgets we constrain to, the time that we have, meet all 5 moments more effectively? And single source authoring, multi-channel publishing is a step in the journey towards that. Make sense? So, how many of you have a mobile device? Yourself? Yeah. How many of you do email on that device? How many of you text on that device? How many of you take photos on that device? Facebook? I'll just stop, right? So the moral of the story is the mobile phone is actually sort of misnamed. It's actually a gateway to a world of knowledge. How many of you, by show of hands, are seeing mobile as an emerging learning platform in your world in the coming... Yeah. Okay, guys. So we have to... But if you think back to Kahn's research, what Kahn would caution you about is don't just add another device that you have to author for, design for, and maintain without the context of how it is supporting all 5 moments. Make sense? Right? In fact, you should look at some research by a lady named Dr. Judy Brown. I'd highly recommend you look up her work, Judy Brown, Brown. She's sort of the guru on the state side around mobile instruction. She would argue that well over 80% of mobile learnings being built are not mobile learning. They are mobile support. The design is not meant to instruct. The design is meant to survive moments 3 through 5 after I have got done learning or have been taught. Make sense? But again, how do we now author for all of these devices when we already have enough to do with what we're faced with today? So, who remembers reusable learning objects? Raise your hand. If you do, you're rather old, as am I. This was our first foray into this, you guys, years ago. It was birthed during the time when e-learning first came about. And this was our belief. Since we were finally writing digital content that was able to be delivered digitally over the internet and on discs. Who remembers discs? We used to have discs. For you younger people, it was round, and we... our belief was, well, look, this is a lot of work. Why can't I take an object that I've written for one e-learning course and reuse it for other e-learning courses? That was our first vision of this. Well, candidly, it bombed. It was very, very hard. The tools were expensive. The technology was immature. And what we found out was we ended up basically rewriting the object anyway, and frankly, reusable learning objects kind of fell to the wayside. The beauty is, with the new tools that are emerging now, we have more of this of a view of what reusable objects mean. We can take an object, and not only can we reuse it in e-learning, but we can reuse it and make it intelligent to be printable, viewable, consumable across multiple modalities. Because I think you would agree that what I want to view on an iPhone, have the time for and the patience for and the eyesight for, might be very different than what I would tolerate on a web-based computer CBT or web-based training course, right? So we can make the content much more intelligent that way. So, what are the advantages? Well, first off, time. How many of you in here use Lectora? Captivate. Word. PowerPoint. I'm sure I'm missing a whole ton of others. The problem with that, you guys, is it takes a long time to author in all. I mean, how many of you here do design for IT training? Do you take screenshots at all? Don't you hate when a screen changes? Because you take the next 5 days of your life chasing that screen down in all the books you wrote it in, all the e-learning you published it in, right? So single source publishing can allow us to take a screenshot and publish it into multiple outputs and modalities, but just reuse and maintain and author the single shot. And then it republishes out to the modalities and places where it's put. It's maintenance. Maintenance is a huge problem. It's one thing to design these courses, you guys. It's a whole other thing to keep up. How many of you work in an industry that the shelf life of your course is very short? You're constantly rechurning versions and versions of the thing. We do a lot of work in the States in the medical area. Anyone here in medical, hospital, healthcare at all? That industry, folks, in the States, if content has a 1-day shelf life, you're lucky, let alone months and weeks. So the idea of how do you keep these things current when you have multiple outputs? Consistent learning experience. If you're going to journey your learners across the 5 moments, if you could use consistent content throughout, their ability to learn and transfer that content over time is much higher than if each thing from paper to print to mobile is very, very different, author different wording, that type of thing. You need fewer tools. Single source authoring tools will author once to multiple modalities. So you can get rid of half or more of the authoring systems you may be using today because you can single source into one. And then you support your learners across the 5 moments of need. So why is single source working now? Who remembered WordPerfect? Raise your hand if you remembered WordPerfect. Who remembers reveal codes in WordPerfect? You're really old if you remember reveal codes. But basically, folks, this for you younger people, this was way before you clicked on a word and hit a B and the word bolded, like we do now. You had to embed a code in front of the word, a B, then you had to embed a code after the word, an NB, and then when you printed it, that word would be bold. Isn't this riveting stuff? We don't do that now, but my point is, you had to have a programming background to use a simple word processor back then. Well, you guys, the same problem. In the early days of single sourcing, you basically had to have a programming background in order to do it. Many of us in this room don't have that. We're IDs. We know instructional design. I do not write C code or any of the programming languages. You don't need those anymore. XML. You know the acronym? XML lets us make this content way smarter by marking it up than we ever were able to do before. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Our designs have matured. We understand how to. How many of you have been in e-learning for a long time? Raise your hand if you've been doing e-learning for a long time. No one's been doing e-learning for a long time? Well, let me just give you, the early stuff was bad. It was really bad. Because what we did, you guys, is we took really good books, we put them online, we put a back and forward button in the bottom, and that was e-learning. And it was lousy. What we have since learned that that's bad instruction in a digital world. It's great in print. Well, same's happening here, you guys. We are now learning, the gentleman who spoke before me, we're learning how to make mobile instruction effective, not just dumping PDFs on a mobile. Right? So our designs have matured that we can now single source and design content to be used in multiple places. Our needs have matured. We just need a lot of stuff. We have workers that want everything, everywhere, all the time, immediately. And lastly, we've learned about this reusable thing, that it's much more than it was with the e-learning days. So, what are some design considerations around single source then that you have to be aware of? What type of output best? Now here, those of you who raised your hand, how many of you here are familiar with like social learning? Blogs, wikis. Have those made it into your companies yet? They're not doing really well, to be honest with you, in a lot of organizations. We in our industry, we do something very badly. We find a tool we like, we throw it out there first, and we kind of see how people like it. The same thing's happening with a lot of mobile right now. A lot of things are landing on mobile devices that frankly should not land on mobile devices. Too much to read, graphics are too hard. All these kinds of, can't keep it current, right? So you have to really be sure you understand what kind of content needs to be produced to what kind of output. What content works best in each modality. What's good for mobile, what's good for digital, what's good for paper. To build or to embed. How many of you right now have SharePoint in your company? Raise your hand if you have SharePoint. How is it? Has it become a big dumping ground of a lot of stuff? Yeah, right? How many of you have an LCMS? How many of you have an LMS? E-learning I talked about earlier? Yes. FAQs, PDFs, PowerPoints, content management systems. My point is, you guys, in a lot of organizations, we have a lot of stuff already. The problem is it's all over the place, right? So with single source authoring, you have two choices. This is what's exciting about it. You can use these single source authoring tools to write from scratch the way we write from scratch now. But in the more powerful ones, you can also now embed existing content and reuse it through these outputs. So if you have a SME who already wrote a very good FAQ for your product line, and why wouldn't you use that? Instead of rewriting it in our content, in our tools, through single sourcing, you can link out to that content as a source content. It can still be authored by that individual who owned it. I'm just going to pull it in and publish it through my single source and reuse it as needed. There's my maintenance problem taken care of. One of my favorite things about single source is it moves maintenance out of our domain entirely and puts it in the hands of those who know the content and are keeping it current right now, if that makes sense. So do you reuse, do you embed, can you leverage existing content? You can do that through single sourcing. And what's your maintenance strategy? How many of you struggle right now keeping your content current? Yeah. So in single sourcing, probably one of the biggest things you're going to have to get used to is we no longer have to be the sole provider of all content. We can become the gatekeeper of it, but throughout your organizations, you have SMEs who have great content. You have legal, you have marketing, you have sales who are making good content, right? Why would you not reuse that content in your published content? So you can do that and work on those maintenance strategies to keep it current. So let's talk about a couple examples. This was a proof of concept built for the U.S. Marines. Let me give you the scenario and show you how single source helped them. If you were during the Afghan conflict, which obviously is still going on, in the States we have what's called a reservist program, where you are not in the military, you're on what's called reserve. And you get called to active duty periodically, but you're not a full-time military officer, you are not employed by the military, you often have another job. So reservists are periodically called up, sent over for a deployment for 3-4 months, brought back, and then decommissioned and such. The problem with that, you guys, since they're not trained military, they come into this training center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the day before they were an accountant, or they were a fireman, or they were a manager. Well, in the next 3 months, in the next month, they're going to be sent over to active duty in Afghanistan. So they sit in this room and they're taught the Afghan culture. They're taught military basics that they were taught in boot camp and other things, and then they're put on a plane, suited up, flown over to Afghanistan, and find themselves walking down the middle of a street in an active theater. Couple issues. Really poor retention rate. I mean, even though that class was wonderful, a lot happens to you between sitting in Pittsburgh and walking through the desert 3 weeks later. So a lot of what you'd learned, gone. Highly dynamic content. Obviously, there's stuff that's classified, that's military-based, changing minute by minute. How do you distribute that to a mobile workforce? Real-time context is key, right? I want to understand the difference between this landmine and that landmine, and I need it right now before I step on one of those. So the idea of context being important, and obviously they're a highly mobile workforce. So what we did with them is we took that recruiting course that they designed in for the Pittsburgh. They still had the paper-based version of that, which they were typically sent over with as a binder, and we built them a mobile version. So they had the paper-based that they used in class, and these BlackBerries, this is not a picture of the actual one, but the classified versions were actually used live in the theater through Wi-Fi and networks that they had, and therefore they could bring the cultural information, the military information, what they had learned in that class, right to the palm top of the active soldier when they were in active duty, based on the context they were facing. But you can imagine the way the BlackBerry was laid out, even though it's the same single content, would be needed very differently than it would be written in a book. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 2, right? Single sourcing allowed us to create both contents, keep both current, and produce the mobile and produce the paper-based. Herman Miller, dear friend of mine. You may want to talk to him sometime. He's actually here with us. Jeremy Smith, if you look in the back. He is the gentleman waving to the right of the camera. Jeremy came to us a couple years ago with a number of things he was trying to deal with, but specifically, as you can see from the graphic on the right, Herman Miller does a brilliant job of making beautiful office furniture and medical, and some others, right? How many of you in here support a sales team? Or product information or product knowledge, that kind of thing? Yeah, it's very, very hard to keep current. It's very, very hard to distribute to the field, right? So, a couple things. Low usage and ROI on his WBT and help staff. Simultaneously releasing multiple products. So that overloaded his resources to design all of it, keep it current, get everybody trained. And a lot of duplication of content and economic pressures. This content, highly graphical, cost a lot of money to produce. It was also owned by many stakeholders. Marketing had a share, sales had a share, Jeremy's group had a share. So the idea of unifying that under one place to make maintenance and upkeep better was important for him. So, let me literally lay out for you Jeremy's 5 moments then, right? If you think about the 5 moments, new and more. So you want to teach a sales rep the new product, so they're familiar with it. Moments 3 through 5 in sales are trying to remember the product as you're sitting in your car about to go into a customer, trying to keep up with the current product specs when they get changed and what's in inventory, right? And selling against another competitor. How do I get myself out of a bad or a tough sales situation? So in moments 1 and 2, you guys, that's Jeremy's book. That is the binder. Notice the header and the footer, graphics, text, right? This is the e-learning object that sat on his LMS. Notice the graphic. Notice some of the text, right? So single content authored, but produced in a SCORM object versus a PDF paper object. And the things you use in an e-learning online are very different than the things you might need for a paper-based. Single source can allow you to remove or add that kind of content based on the output. Moments 3 through 5, I forgot to change those numbers. Here's his mobile output that they started with BlackBerry. You saw this a moment ago. For the sales reps, you guys, this is like they sleep with these things, right? They know how to use these all the time, and now he's moving into tablet version of the same thing because they're starting to issue tablets for their sales reps in the field. And then this is his electronic performance support that sat on every sales rep's laptop. So from the one, if you notice, as you bounce across the screens, the single source of the graphic of this particular chair, the context below it was similar and shared across the different outputs, but it was also allowed to be modified and unique depending on the output as well. But from our perspective, we author once and then we publish to many through these tools. And then maintenance and things that go with it are considerably easier. So, lessons learned. Inch by inch, slice to cinch. A lot of people say, and I actually will put up the next one. A lot of people say, well, Bob, I really can't do single source yet because I don't have use for multiple sources yet. Well, you guys, I would argue, first of all, you do, more than you think. But secondly, you're actually ahead of the game if you're not. You can start authoring. We have an authoring system at our company, Learning Guide Manager, that does single source authoring, that made the things you saw with Jeremy. Right? You can author to single source. Let's say right now you want to worry about books only, or you want to worry about your performance support only. You can author for that single source, but at the same time, you are preparing yourself down the road when other options open up to flip the switches to make it multiple outputs. So you don't have to wait until you have mobile in your house. In fact, frankly, you're ahead of the game if you deal with it first with single output, but if you incorporate a single source tool, you are already preparing the content to be multiple output when you're ready. It is a trade-off. Did you remember my e-learning earlier? It wasn't the most beautiful e-learning you've ever seen in your entire life, right? But it's effective and was useful for what Jeremy needed it to do. With single source, you guys, you don't get the full feature of what, let's say, Lectora does. Because Lectora does one thing very, very well, right? It doesn't do other things. It doesn't do other things very, very well, right? So in single source, with the benefit of multiple outputs, you do have to be aware that there is some trade-off in some of the deliverables and formatting. Design structures and content types are king. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have dealt with this yet and got into XML all that much, but boy, content typing, metadata, is that familiar at all? You guys got into metadata yet? Meta tagging, that's what drives this entire world. So if you're not up on it, highly recommend you read up on it. Poor single source authoring at its root is not typically because of design. It's typically because of your content tagging and the way you handled your metadata. In order for an object to be single source in multiple use, it has to be taught to be used in multiple places. That's where meta tagging and XML and content comes along. So probably the biggest learning curve all of us have in this room is this idea of understanding what this world of metadata and content types means. Involve your learners in other SMEs. This will be a whole new world for you folks, because once you get into single source and you start filling all 5 moments of need, you'll start involving other SMEs that you probably haven't worked with before in other parts of the line of business. So it kind of broadens your world of those who you have to work with and the things you need to get done. So that's my presentation. If you want to see the examples we talked about, we have them specifically at our booth. We hope it's been helpful, and we hope that you will take the time to make the journey from single source, single authoring to single source multiple authoring. Thank you. We hope it helped. Enjoy the rest of the conference.